Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of our podcast for Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring programs in academia. Today I am here with two incredible scholars who contributed to the book in chapter 12, A New Vision for Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Academic Mentoring Programs. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to have this conversation today with Dr. Assata Zerai, who serves as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and a professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. And at the helm of the Division for Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Zerai has expanded diversity programming and strategy at UNM and works with her team to plan for, resource, and document the impact of efforts to improve equity and inclusion at UNM. She is a professor emerita at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she served from 2002 to 2019 and held posts most recently as an associate provost and associate chandler. She's published 5 books spanning the topics that we're going to talk about today, and the latest of which is African Women, ICT and Neoliberal Politics, the Challenge of Gender Digital Divides to People-Centered Governance. And Dr. Nancy Lopez, who's a professor of sociology, also at the University of New Mexico, and directs and co-founded the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. Her scholarship, teaching, and service are guided by the insights of intersectionality, examining the simultaneity of systems of oppression and resistance. And her books include Hopeful Girls, Troubled Boys, Race and Gender Disparity in Urban Education, and Mapping Race, a critical approaches to health disparities research. So welcome to the both of you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you both for your contributions. Nancy, hello.
Saludos. Thank you for inviting.
I am particularly excited for this chapter because I believe, and many of our authors and contributors have discussed it, but it's also at the heart of my work of ensuring that we are looking at mentorship through a lens of equity and inclusion. So can you share with us what inspired your research and your contributions to this book?
I can jump in, Nancy, if that's all right. So yeah, as a faculty member for almost 3 decades now, mentoring is really just a big part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. I remember that as a grad student, I had a fellowship, and so I didn't have to work as a teaching assistant or a research assistant on faculty members' projects, which I thought was a good thing initially. But what I was hungry for was actually mentorship. I had been mentored heavily as an undergrad by administrators and faculty alike from multiple departments. So it was really a void that I felt as a Black female grad student. Fortunately, I was admitted with a cohort of 3 other Black women to the University of Chicago, which was the top sociology program in the country at the time. And so what we discovered was peer mentoring. We sort of mentored each other to get through the program. But our busy faculty in the program seemed to not really be interested in mentoring students who didn't work directly for them on their research projects. And so we were left to kind of fend for ourselves. So I really didn't want that hidden curriculum of grad school and pathways to the professoriate to remain a mystery to my students. So I've intentionally sought to mentor my students and junior colleagues and to mentor them in ways that speak to their unique experiences in academia. Further, I'm a part of a transnational mentoring network called Feminist Decoloniality is Care, led by Professor Moletsane at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and Vice Provost Rachel Mabakela at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And we've recognized the absence of Black women among tenured faculty, both in South Africa and in the US. For example, in the US, fewer than 3% of tenured faculty are Black women, and those percentages are similar in South Africa. We believe that our neoliberal institutions need an overhaul to make space for Black women and Black women's scholarship. And so we've looked at ways in which we can decolonize many aspects of higher ed, including mentoring.
That is beautiful and inspirational. And I have to say, Assata has been a mentor to me too. There's a lot of co-mentoring, and I'm so grateful for that. So in my case, I think part of what compels me to do this work is that it's hard work. It's a labor of love. And it's also about paying it forward. So a little bit about myself. So I may be the first US-born Black Latina to earn a doctorate in sociology in my field, as far as I know. And I also come from a household where my parents, immigrants from the Dominican Republic, never had the privilege of pursuing education beyond the second grade, but everything I know, and I'm still learning, comes from their cultural wealth, right? And so I think that that also made me realize that there was a need to diversify academia. And my role is to create more opportunities to open doors, just as Assata mentioned, the hidden curriculum, right? What's not said, in terms of what university success might look like for you, especially if you're coming from a background that was not expected. I go back to elementary school and having teachers who automatically assumed that because English was not my first language, that I wasn't going to amount to much. And other teachers who thought the opposite and said, you're college material. And knowing that has been an inspiration to me, because I know that there's ways that I can also create that level of vision and support. And I'm proud to say that in the 22 years that I've worked at the University of New Mexico, I've served on over 80 PhD and MA committees. And a lot of people say, well, why did you do that? You don't have to do that. Well, I feel compelled to do it because I know I wouldn't be here if it weren't for many, many mentors who, even if they weren't formally compensated, just took an interest and supported me in whatever way they could. So I see it as something that I hope the people that I'm mentoring will do for the others as well.
Thank you so much for that. I know for myself, mentors had a significant impact, and that has so contributed to my desire to advance mentoring and to make mentoring as accessible as possible. Because as you said, for so many folks, there is a hidden curriculum or a hidden set of rules when we enter academia, when we enter institutions that we don't have access to, and mentors really can be the key to that. So your chapter focuses on employing an intersectional framework. So can the two of you talk a little bit about intersectionality and what it is and why it's relevant in mentoring?
I'll jump in and I'll just share the definition that I believe we included in the chapter. And it comes from Patricia Hill-Collins and Surma Bilge. It's their book titled Intersectionality. And they say, I quote, intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing complexity in the world and people and human experiences, the events and conditions of social and political life, and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one axis. They're shaped by many factors. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, whether it's race, gender, or class, but many axes that work together. So people use intersectionality as an analytical lens to interrogate how is power operating here. So for example, I've actually published research that looks at the odds of graduating by race, class, and gender as a simultaneous social location. And what it reveals is a complexity of inequality, right? So if we were just looking at who comes from a low-income background, we would miss the fact that that looks very different depending on whether you are a Native American man or woman, or African American, or Latino. Latinos are usually just aggregated into one category, but I'm sure if you look beyond that and say, well, Latinos who are white versus Black versus Native American, you'd see complexity. So the issue is, now that we see this complexity, how are we going to serve all of these students in a way that makes sure that they are successful? So I think intersectionality could be a new axis of, or a new vision for promoting equity. And actually just received a small grant from the National Science Foundation to create a community of practice in Hispanic serving institutions that departs from the premise that intersectionality has to be a baseline for inquiry and for serving our students. So I don't know if Asata wanted to jump in.
I feel like you defined it so well. The only other thing that I would add, which, you know, just complements what you've already said, is I think a real vital part of doing intersectional work is placing whatever it is you're studying in context. And so, you know, and I think that intersectionality is not only a lens that we use to analyze the social world, but I think it's a set of principles that we use for organizing, for pedagogy. You know, I use it in my work, my strategic work as Chief Diversity Officer. And so when we think about placing, you know, what we're studying in context, or placing a subject matter or task or responsibility in context, then, you know, how do we place our students in context? How do we mentor in a way that speaks to their unique experiences, to where they have come from, and that centers them in terms of the wealth that they offer, and this, not only their skills, but just their brilliance and their creativity that they offer to our environments. So often students of color in particular, and other marginalized students, are viewed as if they are somehow, you know, at a deficit. And so how do we look at students and other people that we're mentoring in that proper context that appreciates the strengths that they bring to our environments?
Thank you for that. I want us to build on that, because you're in your chapter, you both tell some beautiful, wonderful stories about your own experience. And I could not help, as I was reading, reflect on my own experience in academia, and both in my undergraduate and graduate, you know, having experiences with professors that, you know, now in hindsight, I could look back and go, you know, those could have been way better experiences. And you talk about intersectionality is key because traditional frameworks have had pitfalls. So can you talk a little bit about what those pitfalls are, and how important this shift, this paradigm shift, and how we're approaching students whose backgrounds are different from our own is to actually creating effective mentoring relationships?
I know I shared the story of being, you know, in a graduate seminar and explaining that part of the reason that I wanted to pursue research on the Dominican community, which is, you know, where I grew up, is because I wanted to produce work that helped us change policy and resources, et cetera. I am a Head Start baby. I'm an Upward Bound baby, meaning if it weren't for social policies that tried to create equity lifts and the research that accompanies that, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And the response I got was, well, what do you want to do that for? Why are you here? That's not what you're here to do. And I can tell you that in many programs, that is still the case. I've seen some progress and some change so that all kind of knowledge production is welcome. But there was a time where if you were considered an applied sociologist who's actually looking at issues that are policy relevant, that might not be scholarly. And so that's unfortunate, because I could just imagine the impact of that type of gatekeeping, right? In terms of the knowledge that we've lost, the opportunities that we've lost, in terms of learning new things that would have been possible if we had a more expanded idea of what counts as knowledge. And also if we had the accompanying support and mentoring for students who wanted to pursue that. Not every student wants to, and that's fine. But the idea that only certain knowledge productions welcome here and mentored here is very problematic.
Absolutely. So yeah, I guess I would say that there are some common missteps in mentoring relationships. One is faculty members' fixed mindsets and one-dimensional approaches toward graduate students from marginalized groups. So just the idea that as a Black graduate student, for example, that you don't quote unquote have it. You know, you can't get it in terms of math or science or statistics or whatever it is, you know, that one-dimensional approach, that intelligence looks like one thing, and not tapping into different intelligences and different ways that we can learn material. I think that's one of the common missteps. Another one is deficit perspectives, as I mentioned before, about women, non-binary folks, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC grad students' intellectual contributions. And so what Nancy had to say in terms of just often we are interested in studying our own communities, and hopefully this is not the case as much anymore. But I know when I was in grad school, if you wanted to do that, you had to compare with white communities, you know, like that somehow made the study valid if it was a comparative study. And so, yeah, these deficit perspectives in terms of looking at the strengths of what we want to study, you know, that those are legitimate topics in and of themselves. So anyway, that's another one. Another one is, which we administered a racial and intersectional microaggression survey, Nancy and I did in 2021. And one of the microaggressions that students talked about quite a bit are color, gender, disability, class, and other power evasive perspectives on the part of faculty, and their resultant lack of intervention when graduate students are targets of bias, microaggressions, and bullying. And so we had a student in medical school talking about the fact that patients were using racial epithets against her. And her faculty member who was mentoring her told her, well, she just needed to have thick skin. If she expected to succeed as a medical doctor, then, you know, she needed to just toughen up, as opposed to looking at policies around, you know, it's not okay. You know, it's certainly not okay for patients to yell sexist things at nurses. And so why should it be okay for them to yell racist things at a Black student who's studying to be a medical doctor? So just, yeah, that is definitely a misstep. Another one is insensitive and triggering comments by faculty. They make these comments unthinkingly often, and when they're called on it, then they get defensive, as opposed to, you know, really listening and changing their behavior in their words. So obviously you can't have a positive mentoring relationship when you're dealing with someone who is insensitive. And then the last one I'll mention is a lack of critical reflexivity. And this is one that Nancy might want to talk about because she does work on this. A lack of critical reflexivity among faculty who've been assigned to serve as mentors to women, non-binary, and BIPOC grad students. So I'm going to punt to Nancy because she has great examples of this one and ideas about how to work against this lack of critical reflexivity.
Thank you. So we do use a little vignette that I kind of created based on all the years of mentoring that I've received and also that I've been a part of. And part of it is, imagine that you're about to meet a student for the first time and you're trying to create a productive mentoring relationship. One of the things that I try to do is share a little bit about my positionality and talk about my story in terms of race, gender, class, other axes of inequality that you feel comfortable sharing, but at least you reflect on. Even if you don't feel comfortable sharing it, at least you have the opportunity to do some critical reflection. So the assumption that everyone has, funding to attend a conference, or that they're going on vacation, or that they don't have to have 3 jobs, especially when you are the first in your family to go to college, while you're in college, while you're in high school, that you have to provide not only for other siblings, but the parents. All these assumptions that are evidence of the lack of critical reflexivity, right? And so we try to produce a situation where people can think and share with their mentee in a way that's productive. And I know Mildred Boveda and Weinstein have a piece, an article where they talk about intersectionally conscious collaborations and mentoring. So that is a beautiful explanation of what that looks like in practice, particularly in STEM, but in any field. And I would urge us to think about it not only at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the department practice and policy, and also at the level of the university practice and policy. So when I went to grad school, and this was at the City University of New York over 30 years ago, there were very few people that were funded. I was not one of them, but I did notice a pattern. Very few first generation college students were funded. And that is something that the institution needs to think about, especially for students coming from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. So I guess at the level of an academic program review, if your department is doing one and you're not using intersectional metrics to see who you're serving, who's being allowed, and especially in terms of graduate studies, but also at the undergraduate level, who's graduating, what are their outcomes, and is every type of knowledge production welcome there, then maybe we have missed an opportunity to critically reflect, not only at the individual level, but also at the level of the department and the college and university. So critical reflexivity, I think a lot of people get tempted into thinking it's just at the individual level, but it really implicates the entire enterprise. So yeah, I think that that is a tool. It's a tool, not for saying, oh, you only these kind of people can mentor. Another beautiful piece that we cite is by Marisela Martinez Cola, where she talks about the different kinds of mentors that you can have. People who are simply going to list you on their CV versus someone who's actually going to be your co-conspirator and advocate and mutually respecting what you bring to the table as well. So I would highly recommend that piece in terms of another resource.
Yeah, thank you for that. It brings up for me in chapter, I believe it's chapter 17, case study 2, written by 3 incredible scholars and practitioners from University of Texas, El Paso, just down south from us. And in their definition, they redefined mentoring to include validating the experience, the lived experience and cultural experiences of our mentee, which for me so deeply reminded me of the work that you all are talking about being able to acknowledge the experience that folks are bringing to the table and have in the institution. And when those microaggressions and experience of discrimination aren't acknowledged, it's such a breach of trust within the institution. And so in addition to the cultural reflexivity that you talk about as a powerful tool, you also talk about culturally responsive mentoring. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about, because certainly I think for folks in pedagogy and in education, they've heard of culturally responsive teaching. In my work and working with organizations, we talk about inclusive leadership or leading with cultural competence. So can you talk about what that looks like in mentoring?
So in terms of culturally responsive pedagogy, you know what? I'm going to start with the last thing instead of the first thing. So the last thing I think is the most important thing, and that is cultural humility. And so, as a result of people just getting so excited about cultural competence and wanting to learn about it, and then, wanting to show how competent they are, sometimes they forget the other side of it, which is humility. So I'm starting with that today, because so often we have white allies in particular who really want to be advocates. They really want to be accomplices. But in their excitement to be helpful, they forget that they don't really know it all. And so that humility, it's really hard to have an honest relationship with the mentee, especially if they're from a minoritized group and you're not, or in terms of axes of oppression and privilege. If you're privileged in ways that they're not, and you're not humble, I think it's just really, really difficult to have an honest relationship, which to me, I think is the basis of a really good mentoring relationship. And so, yeah, I think that's the thing that I really want to highlight. I think all the other aspects of what it means to be culturally responsive are relevant to mentoring, as we talked about in the chapter. But the main thing that I have noticed serving at a minority serving institution among very well-meaning white faculty, people I very much appreciate, and I know that they have the best interest of their students at heart. But when they try to act like they're experts in someone else's culture, it's just very off-putting, and it just doesn't lead to a positive relationship.
Mm. You're reminding me of some of the other traumas I had as a graduate student, where I had some faculty who proclaimed that Dominican women learned feminism when they arrived in the United States. And I just, thinking about all the Black Dominican women that I knew in my family who taught me how to be a feminist, who never migrated, some of whom never migrated to the United States, was another example, right, of the lack of cultural humility. The idea that they went and did some field work and they already know everything about the culture. But the other thing that you reminded me of was when I was a grad student, I was doing field work at a local high school in New York. This was in the late 90s. I learned a lot of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy from a Latina teacher that I was observing, who was not from the same background. She described herself as middle class. She was not a Black Latina. She talked about how she connected with these young kids who were like me. Most of them were Dominican, Black, Latino, low income, no one in their family went to college, etc. But found a way of making whatever examples she was using in class relevant to their students. I'm currently working on a research project in collaboration with co-PIs who are in California, and also Dr. Steve Desai, who's co-chairing the Diversity Council Curriculum Committee with me. And one of the things that we learn, again, from these ethnic studies teachers, but not only, it's not only ethnic studies teachers, is that they make sure that they're making connections to the lived realities and whatever content it could be a STEM class, it could be a math class, it could be an ethnic studies or social studies class. So I think the idea that your students know a lot, and whatever you're teaching, there's a way that you can connect that to their lived realities, is part of being a culturally responsive teacher. And then the last thing I can think of is that I know that when many students come to visit my office, they may have come with some kind of issue that has been happening to them, whether or not they're in our department. So I mentor students not only in sociology, obviously, and they say that when they leave, they feel empowered. And part of it is that I try to cultivate a space that is empowering. In other words, si se puede, yes, we can, right? Here is, I try to incorporate artwork and things that in many ways are reflective of the diversity and the beauty and the cultural wealth of all the students that we serve. So there's multiple things that can be done, not only pedagogy, but also the kinds of spaces, what it feels like to be in our workspaces, in our classrooms matters.
Yeah, and you and I think that leads us to something else you bring up in terms of how mentors can prepare themselves to be culturally responsive is intersectional inquiry. So can you talk more about that and what that would actually look like in terms of practice if I'm, building a mentoring program in higher ed or in the private sector, what might that process look like?
I can just jump in by saying
Yeah,
one of the
please.
first things would be having a data infrastructure to capture that. And so one of the things that I think New Mexico has the opportunity to be the first in the country is to create an infrastructure where we collect parent educational attainment from preschool to grad school. And that coupled with race and gender and all these other axes of inequality and disaggregated data, especially for Latinos in a state that is predominantly Hispanic, we know that there's major disparities that remain hidden when we don't do that. So that inquiry could begin with your data infrastructure, but then beyond that, I think we alluded to it in talking about how even in that first meeting, and I do describe a composite situation where a student who's coming from a background that is very different from mine. She may be racialized as very light skinned and white passing, Latina, maybe Spanish isn't her first language. Maybe she identifies as LGBTQ. Maybe she's undocumented. I've never been undocumented and never had to fear that my parents didn't have papers, but that means it's not about weighing, oh, who's more oppressed? That's a category of experience that I don't have. But how do I share my experience and then shift to understand someone else's so that we can create better understanding and more compassion for each other and a productive working relationship, respectful. Again, does that mean that I start inquiring, oh, what's, no, I share what I can and what I feel comfortable with, but I also reflect on what is not shared in order to create a more productive and supportive relationship. I don't think it would be wise for us to force anyone to disclose any identity that is not something they're willing to share, but to be sensitive and cognizant that you don't know everything, you cannot possibly experience what this person is experiencing, but you can at least develop some level of compassion and some level of productive working relationship and collaboration.
Thank you for that. So moving forward as we think about the work that you have shared, something you talked about was in terms of your lessons learned, some of those points we've touched on, but one of them was about creating a community of practice. So can you talk about what that looks like, particularly in the context of a mentoring program?
So this Feminist Decoloniality is Care network that we've built with folks in South Africa and the US is definitely a great example of a community of practice. And one of the reasons that we need a community of practice, or COP, is that if we look at the dominant ways that our neoliberal institutions operate, they operate in very traditional ways that, we were all trained with these perspectives. We were trained in these disciplines that were really grounded in Eurocentrism. And so to think about things in a different way in an academic setting, it doesn't necessarily come naturally. The fact that, we are both full professors in sociology means we came up through a particular system that is very traditional. And that's what we had to master in order to get to this point, to get published, all the things that we needed to do to become full professors. And so if you want to start thinking and doing things in a different way, you need people around you who are going to check you. And that's one thing I love about Nancy Lopez, because she will check me in a minute. She'll be like, well, what about blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, yeah. And so, yeah, you just need people around you who can help you think about things in new ways, help you be self-reflective when you do make those missteps, because we've all been trained, through these traditional structures. And so that at the base is why you need a community of practice around you. Because if you want to build something new, of course, Audre Lorde, of course, said that, the master's tools can't tear down the master's house, and we don't want to just tear down the master's house. We want to create a new house. And so how do we develop new tools to create that new house? You need people around you to build those tools together.
Thank you so much for that. I think in the work that I've done, I've tried to look at how do these mindsets that we have all been, institutionalized through, and as you've talked about that decolonization and how whiteness can show up in mentoring relationships, and the lack of cultural humility and cultural competence affects students and professionals in mentoring relationships, and how important it is for folks to go through these processes, both for the mentor and mentee, and understanding the mindsets we have that aren't supporting and contributing positively to our engagement, and then the practice of unlearning the things that we have been taught, and that's so powerful, and it's so important in mentoring relationships, particularly today, as institutions and organizations are recognizing the power of mentoring in their DE&I initiatives. However, if those mentors do not have the cultural humility and are not being culturally responsive and looking at those intersectionalities, then institutional organizations won't have the outcomes that they're seeking, right? And that's so critical, because you in your chapter you talk about that woundedness, right? That when it's not done correctly, we wound people, and that lasts forever. I think that you've shared that in your stories.
Absolutely. And the insidious thing about academic woundedness is that it reproduces itself. And so, you may have had a negative experience with your advisor. We're not really taught to be advisors. And so that's how you learn to be an advisor. And then you perpetrate that same, you try to avoid it. But again, without a community of practice, you're not getting the edification that you need to do things differently. And then you perpetuate it. And then your student perpetuates it. And so, academic woundedness is definitely something that we have to pay attention to. And Dr. Stephanie McIver, who is the executive director of our student health and counseling here, has been doing research on this. And she talks about using tools to interrupt that woundedness. So again, you don't perpetuate it to your student and then to their student, and then it just keeps going on and on. So that is definitely an important concept to pay attention to. I'm blanking on her first name, but Dr. Barnett has written a book talking about academic woundedness and creating sister circles as a way to heal from academic woundedness. And so again, all of the answers are about community and coming together with others. We can't sort of figure all this out on our own in a little bubble somewhere or in a vacuum. We really need our community of sisters around us to help us think about doing mentoring in a new way and to heal from the hurts of the past.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So as we close our time together, one, I really hope people dive into your chapter the way that I did. There were sort of 8 key points you all outlined that we're not going to cover today, but that really take people in depth and really provide some practical approaches to how we include this intersectional framework into our mentoring. But before we go, I want to ask you 3 questions in terms of integrating, incorporating this work in mentoring. What do you think is a must-have? If I'm a program coordinator and I am building a program out for the first time, and I am thinking, you know, I want to do this through an intersectional lens, what is something that I must have as part of my work in building out a mentoring program?
Well, I think Asata spoke to it beautifully about the community of practice. It takes a village. This is not one way or even two-way street. It really is a community effort. And so I remember my first tenure track job was actually at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. This was in '99. And it was a beautiful opportunity because it was kind of practicing this community mentoring. And it was a joint appointment in sociology and the Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy. And so I didn't only have someone I can talk to in my department, but I had a whole family in a village, including people who were not in my college, but that were part of multi-layered mentoring. So I think a must-have is to have a community of practice. And I mentioned that through that NSF grant, we will be having this community of practice. And what we're asking people to do is to create a policy brief, an action plan, and a communication strategy. So 3 items that in order to be part of this community of practice, and they can be small, it doesn't have to be 15 pages, it could be 2 pages, but that there's consensus that you start with those values. And then we're also instituting monthly cafecitos. So if you want to come on Friday mornings, and we have this all posted at the website for the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice that I co-founded and still direct since 2009, just go hit events. Our first one is going to be on March 9th. We actually have a meeting this Wednesday, this coming up, not this Friday, but the following Friday, to have conversations about how we can practice intersectionality in the way we revise the federal standards on race and ethnicity. So it does take a village, it takes an effort, it takes a convening space. We don't have all the answers. We can learn from each other, and we can create a sense of community and love and empowerment.
And what would you identify as something that's nice to have? Maybe I can't have everything, but what would be a nice to have?
I don't know if it's nice to have. I think it's a little closer to the must have. And, and this is in terms of the actual mentoring relationship. But I guess for a program, maybe to systematically create a way to ensure that there's good communication between mentee and mentor, transparency, and clear expectations. Yeah. I can't tell you how many mentor relationships go off kilter because there isn't clarity in terms of the expectations of what that relationship should look like. A mentoring contract, I guess, could be a nice to have, which I think helps with communication, transparency, and expectations. And there are really great examples of mentoring contracts on the CIMER, C-I-M-E-R website, which stands for the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences in Research. So if you just Google CIMER, C-I-M-E-R, and mentoring contracts, you should be able to find those. And so I think probably the contract is a nice to have.
Excellent. And what can we live without moving forward? What can we just live without?
Deficit frameworks definitely are not helpful. Mentoring programs that aim to change the person, the mentee, and that are just so pinpointed on changing the mentee as opposed to looking at the structure and what are the ways that the structure of that organization or department in the academic setting trips people up. We can live without mentors who head into this without training themselves and realizing that they need that self-reflexivity. We can live without folks that aren't interested in cultural humility, as far as I'm concerned. I think all of those create damaging mentoring relationships.
And I would just add, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything, the idea that that's only one person and it's only in your field. Like you know, that idea I think is pretty bankrupt.
Yeah.
Sure, that's important too, but I think that we have to take this multi-level, the peer mentoring that Asata just started with. I think that's how I got through grad school and so many other feats. And yes, the idea that there's only a one size fits all.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for today's conversation, for your incredible contribution to this book and the work that you are doing in your institution and communities. It's so important. It's so needed. And I always, as I've been interviewing folks and having these conversations and reading through the chapters and case studies, I can see that there's a shift in how we're understanding what a mentor is and what mentoring in and of itself is and what it can be. And so it's been so enriching for me to have these conversations and read the work. So thank you both so much for your contributions.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. It's been nice talking with you today.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Gracias.
Gracias. And thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you in our next interview. Bye-bye.
See you.